Good afternoon or good evening, depending on where you are, joining us from around the world. My name is Omar Ndize. I'm a founder of Inkuru Library, and today I have a pleasure to serving you as your host for today's conversation. Before going further, allow me to warmly welcome everyone to this edition of Inkuru Virtual Conversation. Inkuru Virtual Conversation is a monthly online platform created by Inkuru Library to foster intellectual dialogue, knowledge exchange, and engagement around cultural memory. Through this initiative, we bring together scholars, researchers, survivors, artists, authors, educators, and memory practitioners to explore histories, lived experiences, and ideas that shape our understanding of the past and their relevance of the present. Today's conversation is centered on the recently published volume entitled Intergenerational Survivors of Genocide and Mass Atrocities, Lived Experiences of Knowledge Providers. This groundbreaking work was co-edited by my two very good friends, Dr. Sagar Brijandian and Dr. Sarah Snyder, who is joining us today. Dr. Sarah is joining us today, but Dr. Sagar is not there. Both are, put together work of different contributors to this great book that we believe is going to advance knowledge, but also the discourse on the genocide. In today's conversation, we'll explore a fundamental question: who is recognized as a producer of knowledge about genocide, memory, and prevention? For many years, knowledge about genocide has been produced primarily through academic institutions, and the experience and memories of survivors and their descendants have not received equal and legitimate form of expertise. This volume, edited by Sala and Sagal, challenged that assumption by positioning intergenerational survivors not only as a subject of research, but also as a knowledge providers, scholars, and storytellers. Today, we will explore how lived experience and indigenous knowledge contribute to the genocide memorialization, post-genocide reconstruction, and genocide studies, and atrocity prevention. So to deepen this subject, we are honored to welcome our two distinguished guests today, Dr. Sarah Snyder, co-editor of Intergenerational Survivors of Genocide and Mass Atrocities, Lived Experience of Knowledge Providers. She will share the motivation behind this volume, the collaborative process of bringing together these voices, and the broader contribution this work makes to genocide studies and the memory scholarship. Dr. Snyder is an educator, practitioner, and scholar whose work bridges genocide studies, trauma-informed pedagogy, and public memory. Her career has been defined by a commitment to translate rigorous historical research into accessible and ethically grounded educational practices. She currently leads a curriculum toolkit initiative at the Bosnia Genocide in the close collaboration with intergenerational survivors Bekir Hozik, developing comprehensive educational materials for secondary schools and universities. She also served as an expert consultant at the Holocaust Center, I hope I pronounced well, at Queensburg Community College, where she is contributing to multi-genocide educational resource database featuring 16 case studies for an upcoming exhibition. In addition, she's a visiting scholar at the Center for the Study of Genocide and Human Rights at Rutgers University. As an educator, Dr. Sarah teaches across multiple institutions and learning environments. She's also the co-founder of a collaborative social change, an organization dedicated to advance transitional justice and genocide prevention. Her recent scholarship includes co-editing Intergenerational Survivors of Genocide and Mass Atrocities, Lived Experience of Knowledge Providers, co-editing Trauma Beyond the Time Temporal Constructs in Holocaust Testimonies at Purdue University. That's where it was published. And she's serving as both contributing author and faculty editor to the Humanist 30th anniversary of the Bosnia Genocide electronic magazine. She learned her PhD, Dr. Sarah, as you understand, she's a PhD holder in the history of ideas with a graduate certificate in Holocaust Studies from University of Texas and at Dallas, of Texas at Dallas. Dr. Sarah, you are welcome, and thank you very much for your availability today, for sharing your knowledge and the huge expertise. Of course, we hope to learn from your wisdom. Our second guest today is Sandrine Mugenga Irankunda. Sandrine is a contributor to this volume as well. She will reflect on, in this conversation, she will reflect on her chapter, The Meaning of Writing from Lived Experience, the relationship between memory and the healing as the ways of intergenerational survivors to transform personal and collective experiences into knowledge. Sandrine Mugenga is a PhD candidate in African Studies at the Johns Hopkins University Schools of Advanced International Studies. Her research focused on genocide and the other forms of large scales of violence in Africa. She's examining, in this research, she's examining the historical, political, social, and economic and cultural dynamics that shapes these atrocities while bringing attention to narratives that have often been overlooked. She contributed to this book we are discussing today, and she is also going to talk about her chapter, as I mentioned. Beyond academia, Sandrine is a fellow of the International Policy Scholars Consortium and Network. She has organized and led numerous workshops and panel discussions on genocide, education, and prevention. She is also actively engaged with the Rwandan community in the United States, and she has initiated the Atlanta annual commemoration of the 1994 genocide against Tutsi, and she continues to advocate for meaningful remembrance, education, and the genocide prevention. As you can understand, today's conversation is not simply about a book, but it's also it's about understanding how society remember, how knowledge is produced, whose voices shape historical narratives, and how memory can contribute to preventing future mass atrocities. Before we begin our conversation today, allow me to share two housekeeping notes. First is that this conversation is being recorded, and it will be available on Inkuru Library YouTube after the conversation. Second is that we are going to have two presentations, starting from Sala and then Sandrine, but also here, even if we are a very small group, we are also allowed to participate in the conversation by either sending your questions in the chat, but also after they present and in the Q&A, you can ask a mic and present. Ladies and gentlemen, allow me to welcome our two very brilliant and distinguished guests and panelists today. And Sala, you are welcome to share with us your presentation.
Thank you. And thank you so much for having us. And Sandrine, I'm really, really excited to be joined by you as well. So very excited to be here. So I think I'll talk a little bit first about the process of how we even started the book. Um, so when we had contact, Sarah and I were talking, and I had recently been at a conference and was talking with some colleagues and some people I had never met, some who I had. And in that process, they were telling me, I never feel like I can share my story. And a lot of them were second or third generation survivors and felt like that was almost a separate piece of their journey. A lot of them in this context were scholars, academic scholars, but I've heard that many times before in other roles as well. And so it kind of really bothered me because it's such a unique position to have, and not giving voices to that group of individuals really takes away, I think, from scholarship that could be had, whether that's academic or in the fields. Um, and so we started having these conversations of how can we bring these voices to others? How can we, not just for scholarship, but also as a form of healing? We wanted to bring people together who may never have interacted with each other before and give them space to write down their story. And we didn't want to restrict that either. But actually, to back up a little bit, when we originally planned to write the book, what we were going to do was we were going to interview people. And decided very quickly that we were almost uncomfortable doing that because we felt that we were almost taking their voices away from them because we would be the ones asking questions. We would then be the ones editing that story. And we didn't want to do that. And so that's kind of how we ended up with an edited volume instead. Um, I'm very glad we did because the outcome of each chapter is so beautifully different and similar. And I don't think that by interviewing we would have gotten that sort of representation. So that's really where my perspective comes in. I think it would be, I believe you're going to have a follow-up conversation with Sagar, and I think you should ask her because her perspective is also incredibly interesting. You'll see that the book, she's one of the contributors, as she is also an intergenerational survivor. So she has a very interesting story as well as why she's so compelled to share. But I'll leave her for her to share that. Um, I also know that in my own studies, we always were taught don't share emotions. That's not a part of studying. You are not supposed to be a part of the story. It's almost like you can't have an I. You need to be separate. It's them. Um, and that always bothered me. I always thought that's such a powerful way to get a story across. Um, and for me, coming from a memorialization perspective, I think that is key to memorializing. And I've worked in a classroom with students from all sorts of backgrounds, and they sometimes can't connect to the bigger story. But when they've had, say, for example, a survivor or an intergenerational survivor come into a classroom, that's when they really start to connect that this is a human experience. Um, and so I wanted to make sure that came out in this volume. And lastly, I think to motivate us, I had had I went on a fellowship and I've gone on different tours and things, and I'll meet individuals who are in this field, and they'll talk about their work, and it'll eventually come out that maybe they have a family member who was in a genocide or a mass atrocity, but that's almost separate for them too, as a way to protect themselves. And they've also been taught that that's not important. And that's always just eaten me. I can't, I don't think that's a very supportive way to approach individuals who have this profound knowledge of what does that mean. And in a practical sense, how much we can learn and take that and try to help heal or prevent. So either way you look at it, either before or after, is so meaningful and impactful. And I think by silencing those voices, you're losing such a big voice and powerful voice. So for me, that's, I would say, the biggest motivation. But starting the process, we asked a lot of questions before we even really got down to how do we make a book? Very practically, this was my first edited volume. And we really wanted to do it right. But we had the question of, who do we include? We are both, I would say, a good mix of academics as well as practitioners. And we really made the conscious decision to include academics, to include practitioners, and also embodied scholars. So how we define scholars is very broad-based. And we wanted to showcase that because there are so many people in our field who have such meaningful contributions, but maybe they don't have a PhD. Maybe they're never going to. That doesn't mean they don't have the experience to back it up. And so we wanted to include those people and hear their perspectives as well. So that was one of the first things we determined very quickly, and very readily wanted to put out there. But the next challenge that we faced was, how do you define an intergenerational survivor? I come from Holocaust studies and since have branched out significantly. And in Holocaust literature, it is a very well-defined term. And so as we put the call out, we really thought, okay, what's an intergenerational survivor? We used kind of a traditional definition of that. I think we had about 4 or 5 emails before we finished with the deadline asking, do I count as an intergenerational survivor? Am I someone who could actually contribute to this? And I think we were both genuinely surprised at that question, because it hadn't crossed our minds when we put the definition out there. But we struggled with it because we said, well, we don't want to discourage someone from writing. We want to see where it goes. And a lot of individuals, it was either culturally different. The term wasn't used in their cultural experiences. So it might have been like their first time experiencing the term. And so they wanted to make sure it was an accurate representation of themselves, or they were very small when they lived through genocide, but they had no living memory of the event itself. So you physically survived, but you may not have the same memories as, say, a survivor. So where does that put you? And that was something we really grappled with because that comes with its own complexities within our fields. Are we excluding a group of people who have their own unique position? How can we include them? So of course we included all of them, and amazingly, I don't think there's a single chapter in the book that can't either make me cry or laugh or a mix of things. So very happy we included, but it pushed against these narratives that we learned in academics, that here's what an intergenerational survivor is. This is how you define it. It's clear cut. I think for me, the more challenging one was the cultural perspective, is how do we lean into the culture, but also acknowledge that we have this term. And so what we did is we said, yes, please contribute. You explain how you view yourself as an intergenerational survivor. I know particularly with the chapter that I co-wrote, the intergenerational survivor that I worked with, Brenda, we did an interview style, and it was interesting because she was one of the people who said, I'm not sure if I fit this mold. And it was through kind of just questions and conversations that we figured out how she fits in that space. And according to her, when we started, it was because she grew up in Kenya and she saw a lot of refugees come in. Her parents worked with the community. She became a peace builder. And in turn, that was how she was an intergenerational survivor. In the book, you'll see that that's kind of developed through our conversations, is that also her mom survived terrorist attacks that happened at the embassy. And I said, well, that right there is your own survivorship, not just about peace building, but about a mass atrocity. And then we talked about what does that look like, and how does that impact you as a scholar and also as a practitioner, but as an individual. So it's very interesting to see how even from the start to finish, that perspective changed in that chapter. And even how uncomfortable it made us both, because there were moments where like, how do we label this? Do we need to label this? So it pushed a lot against my own professional way of thinking, which I've really it sparked so many conversations. If I could show you just the many voice notes that Cigar had through this conversations of, wow, isn't this interesting? Look at this chapter versus this chapter and how similar they are or how very different they are. And one of the things that we wanted was that freedom to write as you wanted. We didn't want to tell people, this is what you have to do. Tell us your family story. Tell us how it impacted you. We wanted to leave it open for interpretation. Do you want to make it more academic? Is that what you're comfortable with? We had many people reach out to us after the first round, and they made it very academic. There was no them in the story. It was, this is what happened. This is what it is now, the end. And we wrote back and we said, we really do want your voice. We want your experience. This isn't about academics and fitting into the traditional style of academia. We want to push against that. We want to hear, I experienced this, my family experienced this. And I think that made a lot of people really uncomfortable because that opportunity wasn't necessarily there before. So we've done a lot of emailing back and forth with people, reassuring them that this is actually what we do want. We want to hear about you. And of course, incorporate all the background information you want, but please, we want to hear about you and your family and whatever you feel comfortable sharing. So pretty great to see where they came and the different ways it's approached. We also took a different approach to editing. So, and maybe Sandrine can comment on this from her perspective because I would love to hear it. But when I know that when I've contributed to edited volumes, it's sort of, here's my chapter. You wait, you get feedback, and then that was it. And then you'd find out whatever time length it was that, hey, it's been published. And then that's the end of the story. We really wanted to make sure that everyone felt very heard, make sure that we were respectful of the process because we know that this could be very personal. It could be very challenging. I know even for myself, when we were editing, there were times when I would say, I need to take a break. We would take turns with certain chapters if one bothered us more than the other. And so we wanted to be aware of that and understand that this isn't just another something you research, this is your story. So how do we be mindful of that? So we took a while and we would meet with individuals if they ever needed the extra support. We would email back and forth and say, are you okay with this? How do you want to change this? So a lot more hands-on, I think, than a traditional edited volume. Hopefully not too overburdening. We tried to find that balance of how do we involve people, but also not burden them with too much because we are still the editors. But just respecting that was really important for us as a part of the editorial process. And I think the one thing the book really does very well, one of many things, is it showcases different case studies and individuals who have some connection. And you can see the differences within that community of being an intergenerational survivor, but you can also see a lot of similarities. And one of our hopes is to bring together this community and have more conversations. We want to meet, we want to talk. What can we do? One of the things that we did ask our contributors for was, if you could, at your end of your chapter, ask if there are things you want to change in this field, whether it be academics or in the field, what would you change? What kind of policies would you like to see change? What kind of support do you want? Many people said that they felt that there was a lack of mental health support in our fields. It was very lonely. I know that some people said that, it should be government required that we have people to talk to in field work. So in each chapter, there's usually an ask at the end of it saying, this is the type of thing we need. We need change in our field to make people feel like they're supported. And we really wanted it not to simply be just a stagnant book. We want it to be something that can make changes in our fields and make people feel like they're going to be heard. So I think that for me is the biggest takeaway, is looking for those changes and also bringing together community that should be further represented in our fields.
Thank you so much. It sounds that like that. It sounds like a lot of work and a lot of moving the needles, a lot of needles moved
Mm.
to other side. I believe on both sides. Could be on your side as editors, but also the people who contributed as well. Uh, I like the perspective of bringing a community together and try to understand each other. Of course, we shall discuss about it, but I'm interested to learn this cultural challenge, which obviously everyone could understand that initially that was going to be the challenge. So we're going to learn probably from that particular point, and because I think, or I believe, that's where the knowledge, the contribution this book is bringing to the academic discourse is. So, of course, that community you mentioned that you were bringing together among them. Today, we are lucky to have a Sandrine, Irankunda Mugenga. Uh, Sandrine, um, when I read your part, I was very interested. I mean, I noted a lot, a lot of things and interesting as well, which highlight what Dr. Sarah has mentioned. But before we dive into your part, can you share with us as well your experience of working with Dr. Sala, Dr. Sagal, and your contribution to this volume as well?
Yeah, absolutely. Let me start by thanking you, Oma, for organizing this conversation and, for inviting me to participate. I do think this type of conversation are really needed in our field, in our study. And I also want to thank you, Sarah, and our other editor, Sagar, for including my voice in the book. It's been really meaningful opportunity to reflect on my positionality as an intergenerational survivor who's also a scholar. And I remember when I first saw the call for abstract for this volume, I was immediately struck by that term, intergenerational survivors. And I just remember feeling like this is really different from all the other calls I've seen, which usually focus on like disciplinary kind of expertise. They're either calling for psychologists, sociologists, or political scientists. But this call really was calling for the survivors and intergenerational survivors who also produce knowledge. And so that focus really stood out to me. And then I began to ask myself, like, what does it mean to be an intergenerational survivor? Who belongs in that category? Like, what kind of experiences count? And I am one of the people that emailed and said, do I fit into this? Because I'm one of those people that directly experienced the 1994 genocide against the Tutsi in Rwanda, but I did not have any memories of it because I was very young. And so before even submitting anything, the call for abstract alone had already kind of made me think about my identity and my relationship to the subject I was studying. And so I really was excited to be able to contribute because I felt like it was really centering that survivor knowledge, the locally grounded perspective and lived experiences that I think are often missing in genocide study, or at least are like marginalized. They're not always focused. And when Sarah was speaking, I was remembering speaking to a Rwandan survivor who's also a scholar, and I asked them why they don't really share their personal experiences in their academic work. And they explained that this was actually intentional. They didn't want to center themselves in the work. And I respect that position and I understand, for some survivors, maybe maintaining that distance is important and helpful, and it can also be protective or maybe methodologically important to them. But I really remember thinking to myself, like, I don't know how I can write about this and study this topic without sharing my own lived experience with this. And so that's what really drew me to want to contribute to this volume, just because there was that focus on the lived experiences of intergenerational survivor. So it was really appealing to me, and it allowed me to approach my experience as something that I don't have to hide, because I also really struggled with that. Like, how can I study genocide? How am I going to be objective? I mean, I don't know if objective is even a thing really, but I remember when I started my PhD program, that was a really big thing that was always on my mind. Like, am I gonna be taken seriously? Are people gonna say like you're not really objective? Um, and so this volume kind of, I felt like I was with my people, like I got the permission to be able to be a scholar without having to hide my experience. And so a little bit about my chapter. My chapter is titled Healing Through Genocide Studies, and it was a personal perspective. And I get very personal in the chapter and share things that I had not really publicly shared before. I felt that if I was going to contribute, I really should go all in and be really honest about my experience and vulnerable, because I thought that's what would be really helpful and useful. Um, and I started the chapter with a sentence, I do not remember my mother. And I really start with that because I wanted to clarify that identity that we talked about, and maybe perhaps expand this idea of intergenerational survivors and how it can be. It can be people who have been impacted in the most intimate ways and tragic ways by genocide and mass atrocities, but don't have conscious memories of what happened. So it's possible to physically go through that experience and not to have a personal narrative through which to remember the survival. And so that was the position from which I was writing, and I thought it was really important to clarify from the get-go. And again, thank you for the editors, because I felt like they gave me that permission, and I felt really confident when I was writing. Um, so again, I had that in between identity where I was technically a survivor, but really could not testify from my own memory, and carrying and experiencing some of the consequences, but without really having the memory. And so in my chapter, I discuss how the lack of those memories, the silence, the heavy silence that surrounded me in my own personal experience. Again, I don't think this is an experience of all Rwandans. Some Rwandans grew up in families where they talk about the genocide more openly. I did not. I grew up in a family where it was silence and we didn't really talk about it. And this possibility of re-traumatizing my loved one, it really turned me to focus on genocide study as a way to make sense of my own experience and my family's experience. And I talk a lot about the absence of memory, as yes, it is due to my young age. I was young and maybe I wasn't able to retain some coherent memories, but also, I mean, I'm not a psychologist, but I know that sometimes the mind works to protect young children from like really traumatic experiences so that it's not really overwhelming from them. But I thought that was one part of the issue. In the chapter, I talk about memoricide, and I introduced the concept of familial memoricide because I think it's really important that we also talk about how memories were intentionally and systematically destroyed, which really impacts intergenerational survivors. And so you're left with nothing to remember your people by. Your family members are killed, the homes are destroyed, photographs are gone, there are no documents, there's no personal object, nothing that you can make sense of your experience or your family. Um, and so these kind of laws can really create a challenge for you as you grow up because you have nothing, you have no narrative knowledge. And then on top of it, I talk about that silence that where some family and many genocide survivors use silence as a coping mechanism. And it was used by in my family. We did not really talk about what happened. And as a child, I immediately instinctively knew that I could not really talk about it. I knew there was something. I mean, I grew up in Rwanda, so in April we had the commemorations. I knew about it, but I didn't really know what happened with my family and in that specific experience. Um, and so that was a way, my silence was a way to protect my my family, my dad and my other loved one, because I didn't want to ask them and therefore not have them relive that terrible experience. And then it was their way to protect me as well. They didn't want to, they felt like that was protecting me by not sharing these horrible things like, oh, you don't remember, good for you. Let us not try to make you remember. And so that kind of like silence is also makes it really difficult for you to, especially as you grow older, to work through what happened and have that narrative to help you work through it. And so because of those things, I felt like I ended up turning to books to try to figure out what happened in Rwanda, what happened to my family. And I found that the genocide studies literature helped me make sense of the historical, the political, the social, all the economic as well, dimension of the genocide against the Tutsi. And this really was a huge piece of my healing, a huge piece of my journey of like kind of becoming whole again, was being able to reconstruct what happened. And this could not have been done without the many, many scholars that came before me that have written and done research and documented this. That literature really helped me. And so that's kind of like the main argument in my chapter where I talk about genocide studies being more than an academic discipline, and that the field can provide intergenerational survivor with structured frameworks to help us make sense of the chaos and the loss. And it can also enable us to contextualize our experience within like broader historical and social political context. And so I had not really seen many people talk about it in the literature, and I really wanted to write about it. And I'm just so grateful that the chapter was accepted, just because I think it's great. Like, it's really helpful for people to know that even though it's terrible things that you're reading, even though it's horrible experiences that you're reading, it can help you to make sense of what happened to your family, or what you went through. And so again, I feel like another aspect of it is that genocide studies then becomes not only a space for you to kind of make sense of what happened and rework or like reconstruct your family or your experiences. It's a place where also those experiences can be turned into knowledge that can help for prevention. So the way I see my work as a scholar is that the knowledge that I can create or that I share grounded in my lived experience can also be transformed into knowledge that can be shared politically to help prevent future genocides. And yeah, so and then another aspect of my chapter is that I talked a little bit about the approaches I took, or like, I mean, when I was going through it, I can't say that I was seeing it clearly, but looking back and reflecting on my experience, I really realized that reading the genocide literature, there were like three main ways that helped me, and like three main approaches that helped me to kind of begin that process of healing and repair. One of them was breaking the silence. And by breaking the silence, it doesn't have to be with family, because families might not be ready. Like our elders or our family members might not be ready to share those experiences, and that's okay. But going to conferences and talking to other people about this topic is really helpful. So like breaking the silence and speaking about it is very helpful. Reconstructing those family memories. Is really helpful, like kind of a way to resist against the memory side, and writing our own narratives, I think, is really powerful. In my chapter, I share my experience reading work from a scholar, Rwandan scholar, Alexandre Kimenyi, and he wrote an essay, I think it was in 1995. Immediately after the genocide, he went to Rwanda to figure out what happened to his family. Then he comes back and write an essay that he posted on his website. And I remember reading that essay and being so impacted by it, just because he did not just say a million people died. He was giving specific names of the people that died. And it was very personal and very different than the rest of the work I had read. And so having scholars that write from their own narrative, from their own perspective, is really helpful for others that come after them. And I thought that's something that was really powerful in helping with my healing, because a lot of the literature can also feel like very removed at some point, especially if it's written by people who are not very familiar with the culture. But those three approaches were kind of my experience. So Yeah, overall, my experience was really great writing this and reflecting. I thought even writing the chapter was kind of part of the healing process, sharing things that I had not shared before, saying things like, I don't remember what my family looks like. I don't have any pictures to try to remember. I didn't really know what my ethnicity was like until I was like in my 20s. Things like that that I used to be very ashamed. About, but realizing it's not really things to be ashamed of, it's things that you can share and find meaning in that and create knowledge around that that can eventually be helpful for others. But yeah, I'll stop there and give us time to also discuss more. Thank you. I think you're muted, Omar.
Thank you so much, Sandrine, and for sharing your experience and your insights, your knowledge. Oh my God, this is amazing. I like when you say that your experience in doing this work helped to make sense of what genocide is and genocide studies, of course. When you say that, I asked myself, how do we say that we are preventing genocide if that is not centered, like that human element is not centered? Because that's what I thought when you meant that this approach helps to make sense of what genocide is. Uh, of course, both of both of you shared amazing experience throughout this work. One can really understand that there is there is a challenge of both challenging what we know, but also challenging the approaches, the existing approaches. Uh, and I believe that's where the innovation come from, you know. Sometimes we are limited by concepts, by theories that had existed, and we forget that our brain existed to think. So let me start by Salah, from Salah. You know, Salah, as we can understand from both your experience and Sandrine's experience, it looks like this work was also, you know, sharing the reflection, the analysis, the knowledge, but also self-discovery.
So it's interesting because I think every chapter has its own self-discovery. And then I can honestly say that as the editors, we had our own process of discovery, both together and also separately. So speaking about contributors, very much we heard from a lot of individuals who said, this is my first time sharing any of my family's story, and how intimidating that could be, but also how healing it could be. So we had some people who'd reach out and say, what's too much? And we never said anything was too much. It was, what are you comfortable with sharing? Whether that be, you know, what are you emotionally comfortable with sharing, mentally, or even your own physical safety? Where is that line of safety for you? So you went through that process with them. Some people were more comfortable because they've shared their story, they've been doing it for a while, maybe they've this isn't their first time sharing. But a lot of people, it was their first time. And then it was a question of, how do I share it? You know, what approach? Because we heard from a lot of people, you know, I could talk about it from me as a perspective, or I can talk about it from my family's perspective, or I could talk about it, you know, as a historian. How do you want us to to kind of approach it? And we never wanted to tell someone this is what you should do. It was very much a, we can talk it out and we can help you, but we want to just guide. We don't want to tell you this is how you should share your story, because we thought that kind of counter what we were looking to do. Um, I think for us as editors, there was a lot of self-discovery, both in the editing process, because it was something new. It was, we were trying new things that I don't think a lot of publishers had experienced. So we had a lot of communication with the publisher, pushing back or trying to navigate different things. We had language that we had to consider. We had culture. I mean, there were just so many different things with the publisher that we needed to think about, and they were very receptive of everything. So I think in that regard, there was that self-discovery of processes, but also working as an editor with individuals who, a couple of them we knew personally before they came on, many of them we didn't. And here we are saying to them, can you share some of your like innermost private things that you could possibly share? And we don't know each other. And I think very early on we might have had a Zoom meeting just to say, hey, if you want to come on, you could say hi. Let's show each other our faces. Um, and I think for us that made it very real because up to that point, we had been emailing people and that's, you get a little bit of personality, but then once you're starting to talk to people on Zoom, it was such a moment of what are we doing? How can we, you know, protect people, make them comfortable? How do we fill all these gaps? Um, and so it's very challenging at times. And we did a lot of talking back and forth. What can we do? How do we approach different issues? Um, we had a couple chapters where, it's an edited volume and you're limited on what basically the page numbers you can have. And there were people who wanted, they wanted to write as much as they could. And we understood that because, if it's their first time sharing your family's story, you want to tell them everything. You want to share. And especially when you get in that groove of sharing, you sometimes it's hard to just cut it off. And how do you determine what's important? And for us, it was very challenging because we didn't want to take away that voice and that opportunity. So for some people, we said, we will help you find a way to publish a book instead of just a chapter. And this could be a separate project, or maybe we can do a side project where we interview survivors and intergenerational survivors from this particular case study. So we wanted to see not just where the volume could go, but then in turn, how do we, in this process of self-discovery, help people get their voices heard in different ways? So there was a lot of conversations about feeling that out. How can we support you? How do we support ourselves? I mean, it was certainly, there were moments, I can tell you, Sandrine, I can't read the first chapter. I mean, the first sentence of your chapter. I can't, just thinking about it, it just, I can't. Um, so there's some things that, I am a mom. And so reading that, I'm like, okay. And there are some chapters that I really struggled with, or she really struggled with, and we would trade off. And there were different things that really impacted us. So also being mindful of that, things we hadn't thought of. So I think just taking it easy on ourselves and also our contributors and understanding what this process might look like for them, or maybe we don't know everything. Um, so always keeping that in the back of our minds during the process.
That's a very rich and very insightful. Thank you so much for sharing. Sandrine, you had me asking myself whether this was a self-discovery. Would you confirm that as well? If so, or in doing so, in contributing to this volume, what do you think this approach challenged in the genocide studies?
Yeah, it definitely was a process of self-discovery because I think it really had me stop at every sentence I wrote because I struggled. Then I talked about it in the chapter a little bit with my memory. Not only do I not have memory of the genocide, I also really don't have memory of after that. I think some of my earliest memories, like when I'm 10 or 11. And so some of the things I wrote, I would stop and like call my sister and be like, does this sound like it's accurate to you? Like, am I remembering correctly? Like, did we really not have a single picture? Like, when did we find the pictures of some? So, like, I really had to. I discovered a lot of things about how limited my memory was, which I already knew was limited, but I found that it was even more limited than I thought. But having my sister and other family members we could kind of like, is this accurate? Like, can you remind us the first time we found this one little picture a long time ago? It really helped. Like, I just wanted to be as accurate as possible. And open. So I do think that part personally was a lot of self-discovery. Um, I think, I mean, I don't know if this would be considered self-discovery, but I think what really the reason this was so meaningful to me is because I think it gave me permission to feel like it's okay to use my lived experience. I mean, I'm working on my dissertation right now, and as a PhD candidate student, you always dread getting feedback. Like anytime my advisor is like, I have feedback, I'm always like, oh my God. And it's always like such a like it's so tough because there's so many things that you thought you did so well that you might you need to rework a lot of things. And so when I gathered for when I was we received the feedback for this chapter, I was the same way. I was really nervous and I really thought they were going to say you shared too much. This is too personal. It's not academic enough. Like that's really what I expected. And it was not that at all. It was so encouraging. It was so validating because a lot of time they'll put comments about this is great or like it was so validating. And I think that process of knowing like in my head, I think I knew lived experiences are really important for creating this academic knowledge, but actually seeing it in action and being given that freedom for this volume, I think really is going to translate in how I do the rest of my work because I think now working on my dissertation, I feel more empowered to be like, okay, yeah, I can say these things. It's a little bit different, but I think that has also been a great way, like a great thing I've learned and experienced. I think it's really, really important to center survivors, to center intergenerational survivors. Um, it's it's just how can we talk about such a topic? How can we say that we're studying this specific phenomenon without centering the people that went through it, without centering the people that actually experienced it? So I really think it's important to center this knowledge. And I think what we're fighting against, which you refer to, Amal, is the in academia, there's always been these ideas of how knowledge is created, what's considered knowledge, what's not considered knowledge. But we should also remember that a lot of that comes from um, uh, not giving voices or like just I just feel like there's a lot of way academia is structured that definitely needs revamping. So that this is part of it. That uh, people don't have to have these academic degrees for their knowledge to be considered valid. Um, no one knows about this phenomenon more than the people that lived it, and so I think this volume stating that, showing it, centering those people is really amazing, and it's not done often in the field. And so I just think it's really great.
Uh, that's a really very great. And in, in your chapter, you mentioned uh, the presence of absence. Can you relate that to what you said now when you talk about you know the 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 validation of knowledge? Of course, I'm assuming there is also validation of pain. Uh, how do you connect both and then discuss the importance of this chapter and of course of this book as well, Sandrine?
Yes, I found that term actually from, I think it was a Holocaust scholar who used that term, and it also really jumped out at me because I thought it described very well, like it gave language to something I had been experiencing, but didn't really have the language to name yet. Um, and I think from my identity, like as someone who survived something but don't have any memory of it, a lot of my knowledge comes from the absence of certain things. So the absence is what kind of informs my memory. And so I thought it was really important to like share that and how that impacts, survivors. Um, it was again that it was really personal for me, and that was really actually a really hard part for me to write. I kind of had to stop and go back and find ways to communicate it. Because I think it really shapes who you are as a person. So then therefore it also shapes you as a scholar. Um, and it really that absence does not, because a lot of times when we think of genocide, I think we think of, or at least a lot of time I used to think of it as something that happened and ended. Um, it's a phenomenon and it happened, it's an event, we can study it as scholars, but it's recurring in that presence of absence. It's recurring anytime something happens. Um, Sarah, you mentioned being a mom. I became a mom too. And then, like, all the things that I thought I was like, oh, I had worked through this, they all came back. And then I realized, like, oh, actually, I hadn't worked through, like, maybe I didn't work through this. And it's just like it's going to continue. It's never really going to end. And I think naming it and being aware of it helps you more because then you can be more prepared and kind of work through that. Again, I think these are all important things to share and see as legitimate ways of knowing. Kind of like how we know what we know, and those it's really important to also share that.
Mm. Dr. Sarah, I was going to ask you, do you think the current approach of genocide studies help us to find these absence that Sandrine is mentioning?
Yes and no. I think it is helpful in many ways. I think Sandrine kind of hit it on the head that it does give you names to things that we might not easily be able to find ways of describing. But I don't think it is looked at enough from the perspective of survivors or intergenerational survivors. Um, I think, in fact, usually it's seen as if you look at literature in genocide studies, um, and you look at, memoirs are its own separate thing, whether that be survivors or intergenerational survivors, and they're not seen as legitimate sources of information. They're more seen as, just a story or,
Subject
uh,
of studies?
hmm?
Subject of study?
Yeah, yeah. So you don't get that they're not viewed as important as, say, a historian going out and studying a topic. So if I was writing my dissertation and I wrote solely based off of memoirs, that would not be seen as rigorous as if I had pulled from a historian who may or may not have ever experienced these things. Um, I think there has been a shift slowly, a very slow shift, where more voices are being heard, a larger pool of voices are being heard, where it permits people who have different backgrounds to allow themselves to be heard, whether that's directly or not. I don't think we're necessarily at a point where people are always comfortable saying, this is why I'm here in this place, and why my position matters. Sandrine, you mentioned being objective, and I've heard that so many times in academics is you need to remove yourself from your work. And I really struggle with that for the longest time. I can't wrap my head around that. In my mind, that's the most powerful thing you can do is be, yourself and make your own identity. And how does your identity influence what you're learning about? Otherwise, we're going to get the same information all the time. Um, and so I've always really struggled with this idea that academics need to be quote unquote objective, need to really separate themselves from their emotions, that experience. I think that's changing slowly, but very, very slowly. But I think there is importance in having the academic background. I think Sandra made a really good point that a lot of our contributors mentioned that they had families that were very, very silent about what had happened. And they entered this field specifically to find out what could have happened to their families. What was the history? A lot of them were in diasporic communities, and so they're physically removed from that experience as well. And so, they said they would study the language of their family. They went to the home countries. And for them, having that place of academics to fall back on was comforting because then they could learn and not have to ask their family because their family may not talk to them. So I think it plays a role. I think there's a lot more that can be done. So
Mm. My follow-up question is, was that the motivation you felt very highly, that was that what motivated you to participate in this work?
Yeah, I think for me, I really got my start doing a lot of interviewing with survivors and intergenerational survivors. And Sandrine actually mentioned it, but this idea that genocide is something that happens and then it's done. I really struggled with that because having been a person who's done a lot of interviewing, a lot of them are talking about the impacts of the here and now as opposed to what happened during the event. Um, and so my mind has kind of shifted that genocide is an event. It's something that's continuous. It changes, but it is still impacting the individuals who experienced it and then consequently the generations after. And if we start to understand it more in that way, we can make changes. We can be preventative in different ways. We can also help people learn to heal in a different way, as opposed to saying something's over and done with. Um, and so for me, I'm a person who likes change and action, and academics are, you know, there's space for that, but not as much space. And I think by staying in the roots of academics by making a book, but also saying, how do we push against traditional academics and how do we ask individuals who have these experiences to say, what might be impactful to make changes? Why aren't we asking the people who have these experiences what they would do? That just seems almost like wasteful of knowledge to me. Let's ask, let's find out. So yeah, it was certainly a motivator to be able to get voices together who not only are experts in the genocides that they're studying, but also have those lived experiences. So it's, to me, that's very powerful.
Oh, thank you so much. Listening to both of you, it looks like that that absence of personal stories, the individual, the writer in a story, in the academic study, genocide study, um, is a connector factor, if connecting factor for both of you. I'm wondering then academia is pushing, is very rigorous about objectivity. How do you defend this?
Do you want to go first, or would you like me to?
Oh, you can go.
um, I think it's a balancing act. Um, as much as I would love it to be a little bit further along, I'm also mindful that the academy has been around for quite some time. And I'm just one person. And of course, there's a lot of one individuals who want to do this. I think this book is a great way to do it. It kind of balances both scholarship and the individual. And I think that's kind of how I would approach it in general, is finding that happy medium. Because right now, if I were to walk in to say a classroom and only teach testimony, for example, or only have people come in and give testimony, I am going to get in trouble. Because what am I teaching? I think would be their question. And that's not to say I view it that way, but in the minds of the academy, you need to teach facts and figures. I think that's important as well. I think understanding context, for example, political context, also understanding that, I mean, when you think about how many individuals are impacted by one particular case of genocide, you're never going to be able to hear all of those stories. It's just impossible. So you need that broader picture to really understand a little bit further as to what happened, why it happened, how it happened, and answer all of those questions. So for me, it's about balancing both of those. I always try to incorporate the individual, say, for example, in my classroom, to make sure that my students see that it's not this big number. It is, in fact, individuals. I want you to understand that it's this big number, though. I want you to understand how large scale it is, but don't forget that that large scale is made up of each individual human being. So I think it is really about balancing both the information and pushing back. I mean, I think objectivity is it's a fine line. Finding different places that accept the fact that you have an identity is also, it's out there. There are people out there who really support the idea that you come with your own background, and that's important, and share that. That's not to say I would walk around and say, let me tell you my life story, and that's why I'm here. And that's the only reason why I think connecting myself to others also is really how I protect that objectivity. But yeah, for me, it's finding balance of saying, you know, this is who I am, and it's yeah, I think you have to, because also there's this push in academia that you need to have your own individual approach to everything, or else you're going to get lost in the many scholars. So that's how I would approach it.
Mm.
Yeah, thank you. I agree with everything you said. My advisor said to me, there's no such a thing as objective, and I feel like that's also very freeing because I kind of believe it's true. We all have like these lenses that we see the world with, like based on our own experiences, where we were born, how we were raised. Like it really impacts how you see the world, and I think just being aware of that, recognizing it and just doing the work of understanding how your background, who you are, affect how you see things, and doing that work is important. But I think the idea that there's no such a thing as objective, to me, I really think I subscribe to that. And also, to Sarah's point about balancing, I agree because I think we also have, I mean, in academic, we have a multitude of like methods. And I mean, I feel like all the work, a lot of times when you read rigorous scholarship, people use different methods. They triangulate and I think that can be a way to do that. So, for example, in my own research, working on my dissertation, I am like I'm using a lot of interviews, but I'm also doing a lot of testimony, like reading a lot of the testimonies that have been archived. But I'm also gonna like add to that and find other methods that I can add and doing comparison analysis and all that. So I think using multiple methods can also be a way, because you use the word defend. So I think, that's a way to defend the like here's a source of knowledge that is really important to use, and here are some other methods that kind of also show the same thing, is the way I'm approaching it with my dissertation at least. And I think that's what a lot of scholars have done, using different, like a lot of methods, different methods, to make it more rigorous to academic standards.
Thank you so much. Let me remind our two very good friends who are with us that you can open your mic. Of course, you can raise your hand and then share your insight, your contribution, a story, or something related to this conversation, or ask a question to whoever you want to ask among our two panelists. Um, Obviously, we are uh, learning a lot from your work, and which is bringing a new approach of telling a story in genocide studies. And as you both highlighted, it looks like it's something not common in this field. Um, Dr. Sala, if you uh, from from your experience of writing this, of co-editing this book, if you are to change one or two or more things in the existing approaches of genocide studies, what would those things be, and why?
Oh, um, hmm. Well, for me, I think one of the biggest things that I wish could be seen more academically. So I come from a very interdisciplinary background. Um, I also have a very strong practitioner side of me. In fact, I would say I'm more a practitioner than a scholar. And I think there's this hierarchy that exists in academia that if you're more of a practitioner than a scholar, you are no longer scholarly or not as scholarly. And so, in my opinion, I mean, I learn so much when I'm out working in the field, whatever field work that might be, whether I'm in a museum or I'm working for an organization. I mean, whatever it might be, there's so much to learn that I might not learn in a classroom. Um, and so I wish that hierarchy could somehow be diminished, because having, for example, I'll tell my students, it's wonderful to learn in a classroom, but it's such a different experience to learn out in the field, go out, do something, um, make make purpose of the work that you're learning about. It's wonderful to learn, but I ask, and then what? What do you want to do with this information? And I know that way back when I started studying genocide, I was very much torn because I thought I wanted to be a scholar. And in my mind, that meant, reading, writing, teaching. And I really struggled with that as I started getting into that and thinking, okay, but I want to do something. I want to make a change. I want to be meaningful. And I thought teaching for me is very meaningful, but I wanted to do even more. And so I really wish that hierarchy could be diminished and understand the value of practitionership and how much we can learn from practitioners. And can we make that divide smaller to learn more and have a bigger impact? So I think that for one is a big one. I think overall the volume really speaks to the idea that the individual should be heard more, and we need to value those stories. Understanding that for many, including individuals as well as countries, that genocide doesn't just abruptly end. Um, what does that mean then for how we move forward? I think is such a big part of what we're looking at in the book, seeing how much people are still impacted by their family's experiences. And so when we teach in academia, we're often teaching a certain set of years. And what does that do then to the individuals who experienced it, or their family members, or the country as a whole, or the nation as a whole? Um, so I think if academia could kind of shift its mindset and understand that it's still going on, whether it be denial, whether it be memorialization, whether it be, um, individuals experiencing whatever they may be experiencing. So for me, I think it's shifting the mindset of seeing it just simply as academic and understanding it as a lived experience, and understanding that what we do impacts individuals, as well as groups, and not just putting information out there, but saying, how does this impact somebody? Which I think is what this volume really does really well, is how does it impact a person or a group of people? So I think those are just a couple things. There's many things I would love to see the field sort of shift. But I think those are some of the big ones for me.
Sandrine, the same question, but uh, also if you can extend, what do you think? How do you think museums museums like non-academic institutions, spaces like library, museums, cultural institutions, cultural centers. How do you like? What do you think can be changed, and then how do you think those institutions and spaces can help? Dr. Sal, if you want to add something about that as well, feel free to do that after Sandrine.
Yeah, thank you. I actually think for those institutions, it's more, I guess, accepted or more welcomed to center survivors. So like for museums or Inkuru Library or other initiative like that, I think they welcome it. And I think that's great. I think if I had to change something, which I think in Rwanda we started doing, and we can do more of that, is bringing in the young people more and more, because I lived through the genocide, but I don't remember. But then you have people who were born after the genocide, and they experience I've spoken to many of them, they experience very similar things that I experienced, in the sense that their families don't talk about it. They might come and they don't have many memories to remember anything, but they know this genocide happened and it's impacting their lives. And also being raised by survivors kind of carries its own challenges. So I think engaging the youth more, engaging the young people more, especially just as the people that actually lived through the genocide get older, having those young people talking to them, recording those memories, recording those oral histories, I think it's really important. So I think like engaging the youth for those institutions it would be key. I know that a lot of the institutions do that. But that's what I would say I would love to see, just because sometimes young people also can kind of disconnect and not want to think about it. And maybe they think about it as they get older. Engaging them from a young age, I think, can help them to make sense of all of this at an age appropriate and grow through that. I think it would be helpful.
Dr. Sarah, I think this youth engagement highlights the importance of what you mentioned, which is hierarchy.
Mhm.
But you are mentioning the validation of knowledge as a part of hierarchy, of course.
Right.
You're not PhD. What are you saying here? So
Right.
you are not a scholar. What are you saying here? So do you see this hierarchy in non-academic institutions like those? And then if you can also share what you think this space can do more.
I think my answer kind of goes hand in hand with both questions. So for me, I think, yes, the youth are often dismissed in many contexts as not understanding or not knowing. Um, and they might be the most vulnerable population we have coming in. Can we talk to them? Can we give them space to talk? So I agree. I think that would very impactful. And yeah, I think they're very often dismissed in a way that's unnecessary. I also think that in centers and institutions that aren't necessarily traditional academic, um, having spaces often, particularly in the United States, many centers only focus on one genocide. And I think what would be really impactful is bringing together different genocides and having conversations, because you have different cultural contexts. And so you might have different ways of healing, you might have different ways of prevention. You could learn from each other in a way that I don't think really has been tapped into. Um, and having worked with different groups of people, the things that I've heard that really overlap, but they don't talk to each other. It's very isolated. And to me, that's very frustrating, because in my mind, I'm like, imagine what could be done if we brought these people together and had conversations. Um, what we could do for each other. I mean, certain groups are really good at, you know, getting memorials done. Certain groups might be really great at talking with government and working at policy. Why not bring all those people together and say, let's use our strengths and let's build on that? So that's something I've always found really, really frustrating is, this inability to connect. I think there's many reasons why that exists. Some very practical, just space and how do you get to know each other. I think there's some hierarchy going on there. I think that there's many layers. So I would love to see that change. And I think you see little tidbits of that here and there, but to see that really become more of a basis would be just really impactful.
So that means from intergenerational and intercultural exchange.
Yeah.
So to uh, be able to learn from all those contexts, cultures, but also to benefit from what is there. Like in preparing this conversation, I highlighted the indigenous knowledge.
Mhm.
I didn't ask it so much because it is coming from what you guys are saying, and some people try to define indigenous knowledge as a traditional knowledge, ecological knowledge, but it's a local knowledge. It's that knowledge that of people who lived in a place after a certain time. And sometimes also when people talk about indigenous, people tend to marginalize this term as well. But uh, every society has indigenous, has people who lived in a place, who knows the trees, the nature, the mountains, and the taboos of there. Uh, if I understand well, both of you are advocating that we need this intercultural exchange for us to learn from all these experiences and from across all ages. Uh, Dr. Sarah?
It's interesting you bring up the trees and nature. When you were talking about it, I was actually thinking of the chapter that I worked on with Brenda, who a big part of what we talked about was essentially nature therapy. And she was explaining to me that in Kenya, depending on what part of the country you're from, depends on what type of therapy you might receive. And we were talking about what that looks like. And she was explaining, she was very young when her mother experienced what she experienced. She went to live with her grandmother. And then in turn, she was talking about how, she's in the forest. They make you go out into nature and reconnect with the earth. You are then, you work with the community. There's different steps that you take with nature therapy. And she said, if you live in the desert, you do certain things. If you live in the water, whatever area you're from, they have certain ways to connect to nature as a means of therapy. And that was the first thing that came to mind when you mentioned it, was this idea of cross-cultural. And for me, someone who's coming from the United States, I also grew up in a very wooded area. And I wouldn't say we would call it nature therapy, but we did something very similar. You'd go away for a while, you'd go camping, you would, sleep under the stars, and people would talk about it, but it was never framed that way. So when she was talking about it, I thought how interesting. I would have never thought about it as therapy. I just thought about it as getting away. But the more she talked about it, the more I was like, well, we do that. Yeah, I've done that. We disconnect, get rid of the technology, get away for a while. And I think looking at the book, we saw a lot of cross-cultural experiences that were very similar. And there was so much you could pull from that we were never really expecting because that wasn't really the initial look for. We just really wanted to hear people's stories. And then the more we read, the more it was a moment of, wow, there's just so much to pull from here. And so it really resonated with us to focus on the cross culture and how do we bring people together and, have those voices come together to have conversations. So I think this is a great example of being able to do that as well, because, reading the book is great, but then being able to have the actual conversation is a different experience.
Which also highlights your point, is Dr. Sarah, that there is a need to reduce that hierarchy, because probably the people we see at the lower layer might have that knowledge that we need to improve our ways of doing things or our knowing. Dr. Valens is also a PhD candidate. He's a former staff of CNRG, the National Commission of Fighting Against Genocide in Rwanda, and now he's teaching at University of Rwanda in the I like to call him Deputy Director of Center for Genocide Studies of University of Rwanda. Valens, I'm not sure if it's a question because I might also have a question for you. But I let you intervene because you raised your hand.
Thank you, Mal. Can you hear me?
Yes. If you don't mind to put on video, will be also okay. But if it's not, that's also okay. You can go on.
Actually, I was somewhere in an event, and I may even leave a bit earlier before you close the conversation. That's why I wanted just to follow this important presentation to me, and I want to thank the presenters. I'm not the deputy director. I'm just a student and staff at the new Center for Genocide and Conflict Studies. It used to be called the Center for Conflict Management, but recently we shifted. My topic is about how different people, different Rwandans interact with the memorial sites. And part of my questions was actually how the memorial sites contribute to the transmission of memory, of genocide memory to younger generations. So I interacted with them, and that's why I commend this book, the volume our friends, colleagues here presented. just because you are raising questions, concerns young people have now. When you talk to them, actually, inclusively, if I can use this term, from both survivors and non-survivors, you find and you feel this kind of silence, huge silence about genocide matters, genocide realities, which actually impact the knowledge, the information these young people have or are supposed to have. So I'm glad, and I really commend the works done by Dr. Sarah and Sandrine, because you just dared researching and writing about what few people, experienced scholars, did or are doing now. So to me is a very great contribution to the scholarship, to the knowledge, because it comes from the direct people, the direct persons who felt the gap, this gap, knowledge gap, and you are trying to fill it using the knowledge, the literature, the existing literature, which is very obvious, but you are bringing in your experiences, your insights, your frustrations, your element of curiosity, which you searched for your own. So it's really a very important work to me, initiated by the what you call intergenerational generation, which is very, very key. And regarding the knowledge and the knowledge production, I think this can be actually the starting of having the knowledge generated from directly from the right persons, young people now, who are seeing and experiencing and challenging actually the approaches, the literature that have been used and developed by the adult people, experienced scholars, as we are used to. That's just my intervention. Thank you.
Thank you, Maurice. I hope you will have these two good panelists in December in your conference.
Yeah.
I mentioned to both of them that you are organizing a conference. Hopefully, this approach can be shared as well. That's how we expand. That's how we talk to each other. Dr. Sarah, Variance is highlighting the new approach of documenting knowledge from non-experienced people like young people. How do you think that can be done, and why?
That's a big question. I think that there's so many ways I can think of. For me, when dealing with youth, I first like to start by figuring out what they know and what they want to know. Because you're going to get a range of youth who maybe know a lot more than others. Some might have more questions. It really just depends. I think from there, I come from things very anthropologically. So I then think about it culturally and what is comfortable within the cultural context that you're working with. I think a good example is go back to the chapter that we worked on. So Brenda works with youth in Kenya. I think she was also recently in Kigali, and she does play theater. And she was explaining to me that in Kenya, what they did to introduce the ideas of war, not necessarily terming it genocide, but war or sexual violence, they would essentially do plays to teach students about these topics. So making it where it's not so, where I'm lecturing you and just telling you information. having them almost learn more organically where they're interacting with the materials. They're also teaching you. I think it's really important to give youth the power and autonomy to learn and also and to engage with the materials. Um, I think that's really, really quite a good way to engage with youth. I also really like the idea of having youth work with the older population. Having them being able to have conversations with, the elders of a culture is so interesting. Letting them ask questions, I think can be so really life altering. Um, I have a friend who's a survivor and she's a survivor from the Holocaust and she is now 90, I think 5. Um, and in my mind, coming from an academic perspective, I've talked to many survivors, and sometimes I forget that that's not necessarily normal. And so when I introduced my students to a survivor, the amount of questions that just naturally came to mind when they were just talking to her, you know, and they were questions I would have never thought of because, I'm in a different part of life. I have, I have an academic background, so now I think more academically. They had questions like, what did you play with? What type of toys did you have? She was very little when it happened, very close to, their age, and they're asking questions like, who were your friends? How did you entertain yourself? What did you do? What did you like to wear? And it was really impactful for her because no one had ever asked those questions before. They were more interested in, you know, how did you survive? Or, what was your experience? Were you ever in a camp? Were you in a ghetto? And these kids were just like, what was your life like? And she said, I haven't had to dig back in my memory like that in such a long time because no one asks, no one cares. It's not the important part. And so for her, it was very rewarding. For the youth that were in the class, it was also very rewarding. And for me too, because I started to think about interviews very differently, and start asking about everyday life. What I'm interested in is very different than what the youth was interested in. And that's not to say that what they were asking equally as important. So to give them that kind of freedom to engage was really rewarding for, I think, the whole entire room. So yeah, there's so many different ways that you can engage youth. And I wish it would happen more.
Mhm. Yes, yeah, that's really very very interesting and very good. I mean, you both mentioned this point, and it is it is going to be one of the main take home that genocide continues. Genocide continues, and I think so is knowledge. So is knowledge. So is source searching and everything we allow the genocide. Also, how do we stop genocide? Because sometimes people see genocide, but as the end of genocide is the stopping of massacres, the stopping of mass extermination. But the the genocide also continue in the in the debate as well. How we confront each other, how we confront the yesterday's perpetrators, how they confront survivors. If you see well in the rhetorics, the what is said, what is transmitted, even in the research as well, you see that the confrontation, that continuation of genocide, and I really liked this. I'm remaining with two questions before we finish our conversation. But before doing that, Padilla, do you want to say hello to us, or you have a question, or say something? Could also be a comment, something to help us to have you as well. You mean it's good that we had you in this conversation, but share with our two great panelists what you think or what is your comment. Do you have anything to say? If not, it's okay. And Sandrine, but also Dr. Sarah, you can react on that as well. We are living in a social media age now. Social media is being, I think, challenged by artificial intelligence. We are having two new animals in the environment. I'm calling it animals because some people try to scare us, about the effects of AI. AI is bad. Some also people say social media is it's not good. It's having a negative effect. But again, these young people you are talking about, the hierarchy Dr. Sarah mentioned, it's where these young people are. It's where these nanny traditional knowledge producers are. We have young people who have podcasts, who are on TikTok doing videos and sometimes sharing knowledge. Sandrine, seeing all of these, and how do you think traditional universities should rethink the knowledge production approaches in preserving memory, integrating lived experience into research as well, supporting indigenous knowledge systems. We didn't mention the indigenous knowledge, but of course, it's what you are advocating for, to have this local knowledge also acknowledged and integrated in genocide studies. How do you think universities and the other cultural centers can rethink their approaches moving forward?
Yeah, thank you for that question. So when I think of like traditional academia or like when we say the academy, I think we should just always remember, it's people, it's us that make the academy. Like it's the students, the professors, or even the practitioners that come in to share their work, which is very valuable. So think like from that perspective, then I think it's up to us to change what we find requires change. So for example, with Dr. Sarah and Sagar, like doing this book, for example, that's going to have a lasting impact because we can no longer say lived experiences are not like represented because then we're going to have this volume, and that what that can do is inspire junior scholars or other scholars or even practitioners who maybe didn't feel like they could share their knowledge to do that. So I think of it personally, I think the changes has to come from us. And that's why I take my dissertation so seriously, because I think if I'm in this space as a student, and I think it's important to have these lived experiences, then I should do that in my work. And what that can do is help others. But also it's important because then you need those advisor or you need the senior scholars to be able to support you. And we have many of those. As Sarah mentioned, like it's changing, but it's changing slowly, but it's still changing. Like there are many scholars who are senior and who recognize the importance of lived experiences, indigenous knowledge, methods that are different that are, might not have been previously seen as rigorous, being seen as also like legitimate methods or like research methods. So I think us as individual kind of I mean, I know it's a cliche, but being the change that we want to see. So anything that we feel like needs to be changed, then it's up to us to change it in our small sphere of influence, which isn't that small because it ends up impacting a lot of people. So that's kind of how I see it and perceive it. But I do think, I mean, another thing institutional wise, which has been here in the United States kind of going a little bit backwards, is just having those diverse voices. It's really important. So, for example, I studied the genocide against the Tutsi in Rwanda, but I remember when I was reading the literature starting, there were very, very few Rwandan scholars that wrote things. A lot of the historical pieces were written by Westerners, like Americans or like Belgians, and people who are not from our spaces. I remember reading some articles where like Chinyarwanda's name were like misspelled or like defined in a way that was like, I don't know if that's how I would define it. So I think like also having a diversity of voices and like representation is really important. And I think again it's changing but slowly. So us Rwandans or like Bosnians, like studying our own histories is really important. And that's why I mentioned in my chapter, it's really important to write our own narrative and do also our own research and study our own countries. And more people are doing that. And I think that's important. And I think because there's that shift away from you can be objective if it's your country. So there's a shift away from that, and people like they're becoming more diverse voices. And I think also like scholars who are seniors, like being those people that bring in like that encourage us to like encourage by bringing the diverse PhD student, diverse type of program. Like at my school, we have an African study program, but it's so small. It's like three of us. It's so small. And so it would be like, for example, good to recruit more people and like make that bigger. So I think those changes, like we're in the right direction, but it's slow. But we also do have a lot of backlash against that with the current administration, but hopefully, that gets better um, in the future. But that's what I would think. And when you say social media too, I was just an aside to that. I think social media can also be a very powerful tool to share knowledge because, I mean, at the end of the day, not everyone is going to be reading those academic papers that we publish or like these books. And I think social media can be a really cool place to share this knowledge and reach young people where they are. And I remember I started posting during the month of April. I would do a couple posts on my Instagram about the genocide that happened in Rwanda. Like the first one I did, I think, was the different numbers. Like these are the numbers so people can understand the magnitude of what happened. And so many people reached out to me and say like, wow, this is amazing. I didn't know it was like this. And these are young Rwandan people that reached out, or like American, like all types of people were learning a lot from it. So I think also as people who produce knowledge, we can use those tools to be able to disseminate the knowledge in a way that's like accessible to people that are not going to be reading academic papers.
Thank you so much, Sandrine. Dr. Sarah, this is the last question, but it's building to what Sandrine is mentioning. Um, of course, also covering this book as well, focusing on this book. If this book represents a shift in how we understand knowledge, and memory and experience, what kind of future does it point us towards in terms of genocide prevention, collective responsibility, in a way societies remember, Dr. Sarah?
Um, I think Sarah and I really focused on prevention when we kind of brought the different chapters together, particularly in the conclusion and introduction. We wanted to highlight that the knowledge is there. Let's use it. And that was really our hope because both of us are practitioners, we're both scholars. We really wanted to make change. And so my hope is that this will lead people in the right direction to being able to make changes by using the voices that are there, whether it be the people in the book or people who have that knowledge that didn't contribute, but have that knowledge as well. So I'm hoping it kind of pushes that change that's already kind of there, but needs some more nudging to include different voices in conversations that maybe aren't traditionally heard. One of the things that we didn't get in the book just by chance was we wanted to include an artist, somebody who has embodied knowledge. We just didn't receive that. But I think also getting that perspective as well would be very meaningful. We didn't have it. But it is something we also wanted to see. So I think by bringing those voices together, it gives opportunities. And so I'm hoping that'll be a shift that comes. I'm hoping that I know a couple of our contributors really want to bring this to different government agencies to show them what changes could be implemented to protect scholars and show them that this is challenging work. I think that's often taken for granted is that, people are working in this field and they're just used to it almost. And then it's sort of neglected on how do you take care of people who are working in these fields. And so the hope is that by taking it to those agencies, then in turn, maybe change will happen there where we can support people who are in these fields, whether it be academically, whether it be practitioners, and to make those changes so people feel supported and can continue doing the work. I mean, burnout is very real in this field, because the emotional implications, also the dangers. I mean, depending on if you're doing a historical case study or an active case study, whatever you're experiencing. So what kind of safeguards exist there? There's also, safety, depending on what you're looking at. So looking at those different levels of protections. I think in regard to memory, it opens up a different understanding, like we've been talking about, how genocide continues, changing how memory is, that it's a living memory. It's not something that's historical. And that can go back as far as you can possibly go with any case study of genocide. You have descendants. I mean, we have descendants from the Armenian genocide. We have descendants from the genocide on Turtle Island. They're older case studies, or the repeating case studies, where the groups have experienced more than one genocide. What does that mean? How do we stop that from reoccurring? And so my hope is that by hearing those voices, that can make changes as well. And from an outside perspective, I always try to think of it as not someone who's in it and studies it, but make it digestible. To me, reading these chapters, Sandrine, I think you mentioned a good point that not everyone is going to read an academic anything. That can be very intimidating. It takes time sometimes. I found that these chapters are so approachable. You can take them out of the context of the volume and make them almost like short stories. So many of them are just life stories, and I don't think you have to be in this field or have experienced this to pick one of these stories up, even by itself, and understand at least something from it, which is just really impactful in my opinion. So hopefully that will also change of how we remember and how we understand memory, and that memory isn't just stagnant, it also changes. I think there's so much to learn from the book. I could go on, but I'll leave it there.
Thank you very much, both of you, for your time, your knowledge, your wisdom shared today. This is a very great conversation. And I remember when I started studying genocide, I could always have some kind of conversation with my colleagues. But later on, when I realized that I'm dealing with, I'm coming from a knowledge, a certain, let's say, let me call it indigenous knowledge. I'm using local experience, local knowledge, and what variants call the frustrations to this well-established Western academic. The conversation for me became easy, and I would like to say that that's what you are bringing to the table, to the conversation, to the discourse itself. Awareness for senior scholars, awareness for junior scholars, awareness for practitioners on how do we deal with absence, for example, the importance of intercultural, intergenerational, for us to make genocide, for us to have a genocide make sense, genocide studies make sense. So that we can have integration, which I think Sandrine advocated for, by integration of both knowledge, but also the people as well. I'm seeing your book or your approach contributing to also the increase of indigenous literature, but also non-Western academicians who are going to help on both sides, be it in Western spheres to understand this local knowledge, but also in local context as well, because at the end of the day, we forget that policymakers use these works to resonate or to argue in policy making, and sometimes it genocide studies may become a source of human rights abuse if what is pushed by policymakers, it doesn't resonate with local cultures, and policymakers have power, and the policy receivers don't have power. Uh, Let me say that your work then is bringing awareness to this. In other words, your work is a help to improve human rights in the relationship within societies, especially post-genocide societies, by preventing confrontation. So I thank you so much, Dr. Sarah Snyder, Sandrine Mugenga, for sharing your reflection, experience, research, and insights for us today. We hope to see you again when we invite you at Inkuru Library. But also we are we are available to attend your event as well. I believe that today's conversation reminds us that the memory is not only preserved in archives, museums, memorial sites, or academic publications. Memory is also carried through lived experiences, stories, cultural experience, cultural knowledge, artistic expression. I think Sarah, you mentioned artists when we were, at the end. Of course, all of these help us to have the voices of generations who continue to interpret, preserve, and transmit knowledge and give it a meaning. Thank you once again for being part of this important conversation. We look forward to welcome you to the future Inkuru Virtual Conversation. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Omar. Have a good
Thank
one.
you.